So I'm in, and this plays into things, so just bear with me. I'm in Copenhagen. We're at a big conference. For those of you, I'm assuming a heavy percentage here happen to be LDS. My LDS bishop actually, he's like, oh, you're out there, you got to drink this juice from this certain berry. And so I was keeping an eye out when I was in the grocery store, and I'm in like the equivalent of a Target in Denmark. And I see that like right at the checkout, this berry drink, and I'm like, awesome. So I get one, I check out, I go back to the hotel that night, and I'm sitting there relaxing, and I break this open, start drinking it, and I'm just starting to feel warm. And for those of you who drink, maybe you know that feeling. I hadn't felt this before. My mouth's feeling warm, relaxing. It's like imagine having heartburn and it just like going away, like just a great little feeling. And it dawns on me. I go, something's wrong here. So I call up my colleague, and she drinks, and I'm like, Liz, what is it like when you drink beer? And she's like, what do you mean? I'm like, she's like, wait, no, just check in the can. Like, of course, it's all in a different language, but I flip around, and sure enough, it was like 6% alcohol. So this plays into something a little more relevant, but it all relates. Because later that night, I find myself like crying, and I don't know if it was related to the alcohol or the news. So I get a phone call from the States, and for the past like 3 weeks, we had a Series C term sheet on the table from Vinod Khosla, from Khosla Ventures for I think a 15 million round to further grow the business. We had raised 8 million to that point, and then we had an offer to be acquired. And so we were kind of back and forth, and we had made sort of a decision, and the news finally came like, hey, it's final. Like the company's sold, right? And so I kind of hang up the phone, and I seriously burst into tears, and I don't know what to attribute it to for sure, but I do think part of that was sort of this washing over of really most of the mistakes. Like I'm the guy who remembers the 20 shots he missed, not the 10 he made. It's just kind of how I think. And I'd had a lot of failures. So in that vein, I thought of sharing about 4 of them. And so you tell me what's interesting and we'll talk about them. First is in the early days of the business, understanding to rely on my team and my failure to do that. Second would be early sales taught me a bit about looking for silver bullets outside of our business and as opposed to developing internal competencies. Third would be, so think about what's interesting and then please just chime up. Third is, and I learned this in China when we took the business to China, was putting work ahead of everything, like everything in your business. Sometimes, and it's counterintuitive because you say, well, isn't that what it takes to win? And I don't think it is. And then lastly is communicating while angry. At this point in our business, we had grown we had raised our Series B, so we had we were figuring out the unit economics of our business. We had a meaningful growth both on the user side. It was a marketplace, our end users as well as our paying customers, enough so that we could invest in this opportunity to take the business to China. So I'm out there, and for we were like 5 months into it, and we had built the team. We were already like 15, 16 people strong. We had a chairman out there for China who was fabulous, an expat who was experienced. And then like everything comes to this halt. So I have 2 kids at the time. We have a third on the way, and we're sort of doing all the checkups back here in Utah before we go out thinking it's all good. And then our daughter's born, and she has a major medical condition. So she has these cysts throughout her neck. We don't really know what to think of it. The doctors in China aren't quite sure. They say, oh, send her back to the States. So I send her and my wife back to the US, thinking they're going to come back days later all fixed. And I get this call that we have to give her an emergency tracheostomy, like now, or she's going to have heart failure. So I'm like, what's a tracheostomy? They're like, oh, it's where we put like a hole in their trachea so they can breathe and bypass this area, which was constrained. So there's kind of, what I would describe it as is I went into good soldier mode. I was like, okay, I'm going to be stoic in this. I've got my 2 kids here. I'm kind of single dad. My wife's back in the States. They're going to be working on that surgery. I've got my business. I've got an hour-and-a-half commute by subway in Beijing where I'm like packed with, Chinese folks who are in winter wearing like heavy coats and not sweating. And I'm just like dripping by the time I get to the office every day. And I stuck to that routine. I just figured this is right. This is the right thing to do. I'm here for my business. My business, in my case, provides for my family. My family, so this all seemed to make sense. Well, what happened was, it turned into like a little bit of a nightmare. So, and I mean like bring me to my knees. Like I remember one morning, I'm getting out the door, I'm thinking of my commute, I gotta walk my daughter across the street, and going across the street in China is not going across the street here. It's like going across I-15. Like that's going across the street. It's a real ordeal, and there's lots of cars, and those cars might hit you because the bigger vehicle or thing wins on the road there. And so we're going out the door, and I remember she was like walking slowly, and I remember just like spanking her, and I'm not too physical, with my kids. Like we have spanks, but it's more of like the threat of a spank and the fear of a spank, not the actual physical conduct. But I hit her pretty hard, and we go in the elevator, and my little girl looks at me, and this is she's 5 at the time, and she looks and she's like, "That's not how daddies are supposed to treat their daughters, right?" So I'm just like, all of a sudden, I think for me it was, one, I had a team that I had built. Like you build a team for a reason. You build a team so that you have people smarter than you who you can not just offload, but delegate and say, go run, right, with this. And for me, like I was just fixed in this mindset of good soldier. And more specifically, because that's kind of vague, is I was focused on activities versus outcomes. The reality at that time was my mind was not right. So what I learned from that is, your mind has to be right in your business. And for me at that time, obviously my family, some of you have families, I know because I know you, and I'm sure that ranks really high, if not the highest. And so it was just this clear, it was 5 weeks in all that I was kind of single dad, commuting, wife out there, until we eventually had to do another international move back to the US. But in that time, like if I were to rewrite the script, I would say, man, you need to like check out and check into the right things if you have those things hit. And I had a couple hit in my startup. I mean, I don't know which makes me think that it's not rare. Like the reality is, if you have people beyond you in your life, which you do by virtue of at least those people who gave birth to you and raised you and your siblings and friends, like you're probably gonna have something semi-catastrophic happen. And your ability to sort of diagnose in that moment, okay, how do I assess this and how do I effectively put my time where it really needs to be, get my mind right, and then get back into things. And fortunately, I was able with time, and I did pull back, and then I was back kind of ready to go, and things were more stable. So that's kind of the experience. What else?
So what would you have done different?
So I definitely would have, and in fact, a guy far more senior than me, extreme, like my superior manyfold, we had hired and brought in to lead this. And he actually told me, he sat down and he said, Sid, I think you should step back. You should you should just completely remove yourself from the business for at least a month and take care of things. And I would have, this is a situation where because the business was going, I would have completely checked out and just had a month-long sabbatical to make sure that things were right with my family. Yeah, for sure. Now you're like, all right, he's talking about his family and his daughter. It's hard to ask other questions. The other things we can talk about are
silver bullets.
Silver bullets. Okay, yeah. So this is a big one, and I think and we seem to like those things are appealing. The person so the first problem we had was this term seniority, which I didn't understand when I was doing my startup, and people started talking about, you need to find some more senior people, and I was like, is that like old people? What's a senior person? And you come to appreciate it over time in your career, what that kind of means, but oftentimes we found that term can kind of enshroud a mediocre person, and so everybody in the first 3 years of the business that we hired who was senior, with one exception, was like a total failure. They were people who were not able to, so this was kind of there's a few silver bullets that we looked for and that we made the mistake of following. One was people, like the wrong people that who sort of had what they had done in the past, and that somehow was the basis for us making the decision. And that's, again, a little counterintuitive, but you want to make sure that you understand how they achieved those results. Was it a function of a business that was at a certain size? Was it really that person? Was it their team? We hired someone in marketing who came in, and it was like, you can almost see yourself following. It's like when your friend who works for one of the MLMs around here, kind of starts talking to you, and it's like you'd never join it. Then all of a sudden in your mind, you're like, yeah, maybe I could make money quickly. It's like you can just get sucked into things that you wouldn't normally do. we found that to be the case. And what we found was that it was the inability to execute and contribute on an individual level, which doesn't necessarily preclude your ability to manage a team and build and train others to do it. But if you can't do it in like the first, you're going from like the 1 to 10 million in revenue, like, I'm sorry, you have to be able to be an individual contributor. One, I think it builds a certain amount of respect amongst the team that you will train. Two, who knows when we can afford your team, So we would hire some people, and in one case, their assumption, it was misaligned expectations. Their assumption was that they would come in and build a team. And our assumption was, no, you're gonna figure it out yourself for a while and prove it out and prove the revenues there and trying to build your own team by virtue of building revenue that can justify that team. The second thing was in sales. So, I talked about this with one of our portfolio founders today, was that I remember I was in New York City. I was training a really well-known group. You'd all know this brand. They had a sales team. They were impressive. It was in the big city. I had prepared diligently for the training. We had a deal inked with them. I go in. I train all their sales team to the point of like we're role playing, and they've got it down. They're slick. They're sharp. They have a huge network of people, of clients that they can sell this and push this to. And then for months on end afterward, it was this like painful follow-up where it was like week after week and then month after, I'm like, okay, so just following up on your pipeline, and we found that we never had a successful sales partnership. Now, I caveat this, this is very specific to our business. What we found was that marketing partnerships worked better for us. This ability to, one, you'll never find a team outside of your own that's gonna work or believe in and see the vision of and sell as hard your product. Sometimes we find the right OEM and we can line our product in with theirs, and it makes a ton of sense. It's accretive to what they're already doing. Their buyer already also needs this in addition to whatever they're selling to them. But something's lost in that, and so we found that silver bullets in sales, especially, was something that we made the mistake 3 times. And each time it was kind of the same story happening before our eyes, and we realized we had to develop those internal resources, and that's where we started to focus. Our internal competencies was rather than looking for anything outside. And you realize this, I think, most in the tougher times of your startup, where there's less cash going around, and you just have to figure it out. Like, it is you, it is that team around you, and rarely, and it's the serendipity you hope for, but or that you never expect and are just happy to have when it hits. You have occasionally that hire who is amazing, who was senior in our case, or that partnership that actually did work. But for us, it was like 1 out of every 30. May have worked the way we had hoped it would have.
You said?
Yeah.
The flip side of that reminds me of is I have often in the past wanted or been really nervous to let that one silver bullet person go by, that person that you think is going to make a big difference, and you're not planning on hiring, but
yeah.
you happen to come across your network or something, and they're available, and you're thinking, oh, I've got to have this person. And that's something that I've learned, is that you don't have to have that person. You should never hire unless you want to hire.
Yeah.
Unless you're ready to hire.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who they are.
Yeah. I agree. It happens in fundraising sometimes. When anybody who is becoming a partner to your team and is now part of that fabric of the company, like if they're not meeting those criteria that I think Adam did a good job of articulating, you have to really question, and you have to make it a hard path, and you have to have somebody who's willing to work lean. The times where we overpaid, like it never made sense. It happened to be this common theme of people who were willing to get their fingernails dirty. They valued equity oftentimes over cash, and again, that depends on how you run your business and or the leadership of your company runs their business. But they were kind of all in, and that's what worked for us.
What about communicating wandering?
Yeah, so I have and I look over this all the time. I have probably at least 30 big emails, meaning long. That are emotion-filled, that are taking jabs, and that I look at and I'm like, wow, that person was psycho. Who wrote that? And it's me. Those are my emails. Those are my drafts I never sent. And I do this now to help me. Like, I find that I have to have that release. Like, I am a little bit on either end. My highs are high and my lows are low. It's just kind of how I'm wired. I've learned to like channel it, right? We all have our own MO, but we all certainly have those times where, and for me, I describe it as I'm seeing red. Like, there are things that will just like light me up and I'm like seeing red. I think it's what gives me the cojones to like go after something big and not be afraid to go punch something back. But it also, I have to check it. So I have like 30 plus written. I've sent at least a dozen of those. And any email I ever sent where I was not kind of mind right and I was past seeing red, I regret every one of them, all of them. And fortunately, I think there's like, I'm a good apologizer, my mom says. But fortunately, there's people who I've had to go back and I've patched those bridges, right? But I've just found that it's a little counterintuitive too, because we want to have emotion in what we do and we kind of applaud it. Like, we like the speaker who pounds the pulpit or gets intense or goes on a cursing tirade sometimes. But there's a difference between speaking to a broad audience and not singling out anyone, and me and you having this interaction where I'm heated and I throw in maybe a personal attack or something that now it just disrupts something that's really critical in a business, which is trust. Anyway, so I still look back on those. Lots of those. I feel like now, and I'm deliberate now in writing those. When I feel it, I find it is good to put it out there. I just never send them. And that's my own cathartic way of kind of riding the highs and lows of a startup. There was one more. What was the other one?
Building a team or coaching a team? Trusting a team.
Yeah. So this is one it goes a little bit along those lines. It's strange. I mean, you have. I don't know if and Adam's words are wise in hiring people smarter than you. Empowering and entrusting. You want those people that you can step back from. I found there was this tendency, especially whenever we had an early project in the company. So I can think about this in the early days of sales, the early days of marketing, when we finally started putting some dollars to work to reach our customers. And I definitely found this in China when we first started that one, you have this vision, which is critical. Like, you have to have, see to the moon and back, for where you can go and realize you're only here today. And you start to formulate the process to get there, and you lay it out for a team member. And I think we did a decent job of that, but where I fell short oftentimes was the moment that somebody failed often, I would come in and I would course correct, or I can hear myself saying, like, you know what, like, to heck with it. Let me just step aside. Let me show you how this is done, or let me take care of it. And in some cases, if it's the right person who learns from the tough coach, I guess, who had kind of the Rutgers type basketball coach who's abusive, and somehow that works for you. And I had like a really tough college coach, but I don't think most people work that way. And especially now in the identity of most startups, it's much more flat. Like, if you were to go into Quizzer, and if you're here, like, the accessibility of CEO and people is usually like, they're very accessible. In one case, it really puts someone in a corner, and I'm sure you're like, gosh, this is like a crazy founder who just offends people. And there were some good things we did. We somehow figured it out, and fortunately, there were smarter people than me helping make decisions. But in one case, I think because I stripped them of that ability and autonomy to fail, I don't think they were quite the same, and I don't think I ever had the potential that I saw early on, because I would call it micromanaging, calling it not allowing people to fail, but it was this sort of drive to perfection, and that meant that if it wasn't perfect, you or I was the one trying to fix it, and it just backfired. It didn't work well at all.
Did you have the right people in place?
Sometimes yes. So this is what it led to. So in a few cases, no. So I remember one hire here in Provo was the wrong hire. And I was getting hands-on, and what it taught me after that, and it did kind of fizzle out, what it taught me was it changed how we hired. So, I started to realize, along the way, this mistake, and said, what type of person are you going to have to hire so that when things do get rocky, they're almost the type. I found I needed the gregarious personality that was like, no, I've got this, like trust me on this, and sort of have this ability to communicate, call off the dogs, and the dogs being me, and sort of, and then take over. It was the just a certain style that seemed to work with me. So it really impacted. So it did happen with people who weren't a fit. And we were good at like hiring and firing quickly if it wasn't a fit. And then it changed how we look for people. Like you have a few of those and it's so painful to onboard somebody, ramp them up, and then for it not to work out that after that time we, and on an ongoing basis, I think we were always looking at how can we hire better than we have in the past. Yeah.
So how do you vet these people? That's one of the things I wanted to ask Adam. I believe in this concept of throw somebody in the water to make them swim.
Yeah.
But throwing somebody in the wave pool or something that's, for your production environment might be a little too much. Do you find little projects and say, here's a book, go learn for a month? Or do you sandbox? How do you sort of give them that environment where you can trust them and allow them to make mistakes and course correct?
When they're already on the team. Is that what you're saying?
So you're growing for somebody new. It might be somebody that's brilliant but doesn't know this aspect. It might be brilliant and driven, but this is new. How do you create an environment where they can be successful?
Yeah.
How do you create an environment where they can fail and it's okay?
And it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a few thoughts, and feel free to chime in. I think training is critical, meaning, I'll take somebody raw who's very eager, willing, and sharp, and just lay it out enough for them. Sometimes what's intuitive to you after having done it, been on enough calls, put together enough PowerPoints, looked over enough product roadmaps, what becomes kind of intuitive in your style, you just take for granted. And the fact that there was a process to getting there. So one of my mentors, I look back to how I was trained with a few things in particular, and one was, in sales, I remember having my mentor there with me on the first dozen calls that I made and critiquing everyone right after it. And I'm sure it was painful because the first one I remember he's like C-. And then I'm like, why? And he's like this, and this. And just right there. And he's 2 feet from me as I'm making calls. And sort of that immediate feedback that the bar's very high early, but they're hands-on with you and they're showing you that they're willing to put in the time and that they expect you to learn from those mistakes, that I think makes a big difference. Different than just, hey, here's the end in mind, go figure it out. Sometimes that works, and for some, but I've found, especially with, in sales, account management, even marketing, like being able to really lay out for them and train them on how, what best practices are for your industry or your business is important. What do you think?
Can I throw something on tech on that?
Yeah.
Like a tech perspective?
Yeah.
I was actually thinking this very same thing today because we've hired a couple of junior guys that got us some of these boot camps and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they're trying to learn. They're in this environment. They're trying to figure it out. But unless you have like really, really good testing, there's no way for them to know immediately if they broke something. So they need to have an environment where their testing is so good that they can make a little tiny change and know that it will blow up the whole world and the whole team's going to hate them. Right? So if that doesn't exist, then that's exactly what's going to happen. And then they're going to be gone because they just got fried. Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't all of that come with size? Like, there's a certain team dynamic in size that, like, if you're playing 3-on-3, like, getting someone who's learning to play basketball is going to ruin the game, right? But if you've got a bench full of people, yeah, we can take a few noobs and let
Kind of cycle them in.
I'm not sure that I agree. So just bear with me for a second, Josh, right? It's funny that you say that, but because I'm sure all the really great programmers who are experienced never, ever put a bug in their code. So we don't need testing for the experienced guys. We only need a testing platform for the new guys because they're going to make mistakes. Your question about how to create an environment where they can fail? Oh, because all the people like you have never made mistakes, and you're not failing today. The environment where people can fail already exists. It's called your company. You're failing every day. If you're a coder, you're putting bugs in every day. Not on purpose, but not one of you has ever produced bug-free code. Right? So yes, they're also, the new guy, they're also gonna have bugs, right? So, you know, Darren, you make mistakes, you know, have you ever done it? You make a mistake, right? So you fail. It happens at every level. I mean, I was an investor in Control4, right? They're millions of dollars, they're doing business in 70 countries, and they're like, we have to replace the CEO before we go public because we want the CEO who's done it before. Right? I mean, no matter what level you're at, you're gonna make mistakes. Your mistakes might be bigger than their mistakes, right? So there's always an environment to fail. You just have to control it so that you can detect the failure, have tests, right? You have a plan where you could recover from the failure, right? And there's always things that you know how to do, things that you still need to learn how to do. So the new people are here and you're here, but it doesn't mean that you don't have things that you need to learn that you're gonna fail at. So there's a little bit of the question of like, well, if I hire that person, they might make mistakes, as if I don't make them already, as if we all don't make them already. So I think you're more, start with the attitude of, they're gonna make mistakes. I make mistakes. He makes mistakes. We all make mistakes. Let's create an environment where we can catch those mistakes.
Yeah.
So A, you need testing. B, I want other people criticizing my work, right? So I'm always sending things out. I'm always like, hey, will you please review my stuff? And I want people, whoever it is, to be harsh and so create an environment that no matter who you are, if you make a mistake, others will catch it and will be able to recover.
Yeah.
If you create that, then it will work for the new guy also.
Yeah, that's a good point. I felt, I learned this lesson in China where, I've got a team who the culture is you never disagree with your superior. It's very like file and rank and file. And it confused me at first because I'm like, nobody's giving me any feedback. I just expected certain feedback. And so I actually, and I tried to tell them over and over, like, you need to disagree with me, but that wasn't working. It wasn't until I started actually really vocally pointing out the mistakes I made. Like we would sort of have our weekly we had, I think there was 6 direct reports. We had our weekly management meeting. We'd go through everybody's kind of stand and deliver in your department, and then we'd have our to-dos at the end. So there's kind of a starting with like following up on whatever last week you were going to deliver. And when I started, and this was advice from my mentor in China, was they need to see you admit like your mistakes to them. And I was like, okay, that's no big deal. But it was amazing. They were kind of caught off guard. Like, really? Can he say that? They just expected perfection. But that, I think, willingness to be vulnerable. If somebody sees that happening at the top, the highest level of whatever that means of your company, if you're 5 people, that it's you don't have much top or bottom. But I think people start to get the message that, hey, if she or he can fail, then I'm okay failing.